The 19th of July, 1940. Dawn is breaking over the waters north of Crete, and 4 British destroyers are running for their lives. HMS Hyperion and her consorts, Ilex, Hero, and Hasty, are steaming at full speed across a heavy sea, pursued by 2 Italian light cruisers whose combined broadside of 16 6-inch guns could reduce all 4 destroyers to wreckage long before any of them could close to fighting range. The Italians are faster than they look on paper, better armed than the British captains would care to admit, and their admiral believes he is about to run down a convoy escort and help himself to the merchant ships behind it. By every reasonable measure of naval warfare, the destroyers should be destroyed. They were not. And in the space of 6 minutes, the arithmetic of that engagement changed completely. To understand why the 19th of July, 1940 mattered, it is necessary to appreciate how precarious Britain's position in the Mediterranean had become in the 5 weeks since Italy entered the war. On the 10th of June, 1940, Mussolini's government declared war on Britain and France, and the Regia Marina immediately began operating aggressively in the central and eastern Mediterranean. Italy possessed a substantial surface fleet, and her light cruisers, fast, heavily armed, and designed explicitly to destroy smaller warships, represented a particular hazard to the destroyers and light forces on which the Royal Navy depended for convoy escort and patrol work. By July, the Italian Naval Command was already moving forces eastward to threaten British supply lines in the Aegean. The 2 cruisers dispatched toward the Aegean on the evening of the 17th of July were Bartolomeo Colleoni and her sister ship Giovanni delle Bande Nere, both of the Giussano-class, operating under Rear Admiral Ferdinando Casardi with his flag aboard Giovanni delle Bande Nere. Their mission was to reach the Dodecanese and from there attack British convoys in the Aegean. On paper, the match was grotesquely unequal. Each Giussano-class cruiser displaced more than 5,000 tons at standard load. Bartolomeo Colleoni's figures were 5,170 long-ton standard, rising to 6,844 at full load. She was 169.3 meters in overall length. Her main armament consisted of 8 152mm guns arranged in 4 twin turrets, 2 superfiring pairs forward and 2 aft, capable of firing shells considerably heavier than anything the destroyers opposing her could throw. Her anti-aircraft suite added 6 100mm guns, 8 37mm weapons, and 8 13.2mm machine guns, along with 4 533mm torpedo tubes amidships. During her sea trials, Bartolomeo Colleoni had reached 39.9 knots, a figure that, if even half repeatable in service conditions, would make her among the fastest warships afloat. On paper, her guns were heavier, her displacement was greater, and her speed was higher than any single ship that could immediately be brought against her. The 4 destroyers facing her, Hyperion, Ilex, Hero, and Hasty, were H-class vessels. HMS Hyperion herself had been launched in 1936. They were capable ships, but they were destroyers. Against 2 cruisers already at sea and already shooting, the balance of the morning looked very dark indeed. What the Italian admiral did not know, and what no amount of staring at the recognition tables would have told him, was that his cruisers were not alone in those waters. The Australian light cruiser HMAS Sydney, accompanied by the destroyer Havoc, was operating approximately 60 nautical miles to the north, searching the Gulf of Athens, when the 4 British destroyers made their contact. The moment Hyperion and her consort spotted the Italian cruisers at approximately 6 o'clock on the 19th of July, at a range of around 17,000 meters, they did 2 things simultaneously: they turned and fled at high speed, and they transmitted a contact signal to Sydney. Every mile the destroyers could put between themselves and the Italians' guns was buying time for Sydney to close the distance. The design philosophy that had produced the Giussano-class contained, buried within it, the seeds of its own vulnerability. The 4 ships of the class had been ordered specifically in response to the French Navy's large destroyer programs, the Chacal and Guerpard classes, and they had been built to overpower those vessels with superior firepower and exceptional speed, at the explicit cost of virtually all armor protection. Bartolomeo Colleoni's armour belt was a mere 24 mm thick, running only along the length of the hull, containing the machinery spaces and ammunition magazines. Transverse bulkheads closed the ends of this belt at 20 mm, and the armour deck above matched that figure. The inner bulkhead behind the belt was 18 mm, designed, optimistically, to catch shell fragments that had already penetrated the outer skin. Her main battery turrets received 23 mm of protection. Her conning tower was somewhat better served, at between 25 and 40 mm, but in a ship of more than 5,000 tons, these were figures more suited to a destroyer than to any vessel that called itself a cruiser. There was a further complication inherent in the class's design. Her engines were rated at 95,000 shaft horsepower, but the sea trial figure of nearly 120,000 indicated horsepower had been achieved under ideal conditions. In actual service at sea, particularly in heavy weather, the cruiser could reliably manage around 30 knots, fast, certainly, but no longer the overwhelming sprint advantage that the trials figures implied. The H-class destroyers, running hard, were able to pull out of effective range of the Italian guns in the opening minutes of the pursuit. At 6:27, Casardi's cruisers opened fire on the retreating destroyers. Despite the long range, despite the volume of fire available to them, they scored no hits. The British ships continued to pull away, and Casardi pressed on, pursuing blindly, as it would turn out, because he had made a decision that would cost him the engagement before it had fully begun. He chose not to launch his reconnaissance aircraft. The reasons given were the state of the sea and the delay that launching would impose on his pursuit speed, but the consequence was absolute. He had no eyes beyond visual range, no means of detecting what lay beyond the horizon ahead of him, and no knowledge whatsoever that a 6-inch gunned cruiser was closing at speed from the north. HMAS Sydney mounted 8 6-inch guns in 4 twin turrets, an armament directly comparable to Bartolomeo Colleoni's main battery, but carried in a ship whose design had not sacrificed armour for speed in the same ruthless fashion. Sydney was a Leander-class light cruiser, launched in 1934, a well-tried design that had been in service long enough to develop the gunnery routines and crew coordination that translate theoretical armament into practical hitting power. The story of how the Royal Navy, and in this case the Royal Australian Navy fighting alongside it, repeatedly turned the apparently outgunned moment into a decisive one is what this channel exists to document, and if you find these accounts as compelling as we do, subscribing means you won't miss the next one. Sydney arrived from the north-northwest at around 7:30. She was firing from within a fog bank, which concealed her hull and permitted her gun flashes to serve as the only visible reference point for the Italian gunners. The range at which she opened fire was approximately 12,000 meters, 1,000 meters closer than the initial contact between the destroyers and the cruisers, but well within the effective reach of her armament. Almost immediately, one of her salvos struck Giovanni del Bande Nere near the aft funnel. The Italian flagship was hit and damaged before Casardi had any clear picture of what he was facing. The engagement that followed moved with a speed that left little room for recovery. The Italian cruisers returned fire, but they were fighting at a serious disadvantage. Sydney was partially concealed in the fog. The sea conditions that Casardi had cited as a reason not to launch his aircraft were now causing both cruisers to roll heavily, degrading the accuracy of their gun laying. When two cruisers between them fire approximately 500 shells and achieve one hit on the opposing cruiser, the sole damage Sydney sustained in the entire engagement, it is a measure of just how badly the conditions and the tactical situation had combined against the Italian gunnery. Captain Collins of Sydney ordered Havoc to detach and join the other 4 destroyers, with instructions to press a torpedo attack on the Italian cruisers. Casardi responded by turning his ships south and then southwest, attempting to reach less restricted water away from the coast of Crete. As he did so, Sydney shifted fire between the 2 cruisers depending on which was more clearly visible through the fog, but she concentrated primarily on Bartolomeo Colleoni, who was consistently the closer of the 2. At 8:24, Sydney struck Bartolomeo Colleoni with a salvo of 152mm shells. One of the rounds found the cruiser's rudder mechanism and jammed it in the neutral position. The ship was no longer able to steer. She held whatever course she had been steaming at the moment of the hit, locked onto it, unable to deviate. Seconds later, a further salvo from Sydney struck amidships. The damage was extensive. Several fires broke out across the ship. One shell struck the conning tower directly and killed a large part of the bridge crew. As the fires spread and flooding began, the effects on the machinery became catastrophic. 2 boilers were disabled, and then the main steam condenser, the component that returned water to the boilers to sustain the engines, was destroyed. Without feed water, the remaining boilers could not operate. The engine stopped. Bartolomeo Colleoni came to a halt in the water, her speed gone, her steering gone, her ammunition hoists for the main battery guns disabled. Her 100mm secondary guns continued to fire, operated by hand, but as a fighting unit the cruiser had ceased to function. Within 6 minutes of that first hit at 8:24, the situation had become irretrievable. Captain Umberto Navarro gave the order to abandon ship. Ilex and Havoc closed to launch torpedoes. Their initial attacks missed. Hyperion joined them. A second wave of torpedoes was fired, and one struck the stricken cruiser, the torpedo coming from Ilex, striking forward and detonating with sufficient force to blow away the entire first 30 meters of Bartolomeo Colleoni's bow. At 8:50, Casardi turned Giovanni del Bande Nere back toward her sister ship, apparently intending to render assistance. He closed the position, assessed the situation, and determined it was hopeless. He turned away to the west and fled at high speed, pursued by Sydney, Hero, and Hasty. He was not caught. Then Hyperion launched a torpedo of her own. It struck Bartolomeo Colleoni amidships. The flooding that followed was severe and rapid. The cruiser capsized and went down. Ilex, Havoc, and Hyperion turned to the area where survivors were in the water. They recovered 525 men from the sea. Of those, 8 subsequently died of their wounds and were buried at sea. 50 more men attempted to swim to the coast of Crete independently, only 7 of them survived, picked up eventually by a Greek fishing boat. Captain Navarro and 3 other men died later aboard the hospital ship Maine at Alexandria. They were buried at Alexandria, and in a gesture that speaks to the particular codes of that era of naval warfare, the captains of Sydney and the attending destroyers served as pallbearers at the funeral. The rescue operation was cut short when Italian aircraft arrived and began bombing the ships engaged in recovering survivors. When the final accounting was made, 121 men out of a crew of 643 had been killed. Sydney, for her part, had fired approximately 1,300 shells during the engagement and scored 5 hits. The 2 Italian cruisers between them had fired around 500 shells and achieved 1 hit on the British force. The disparity in volume of fire was significant. The disparity in accuracy was more so. The tactical result of Cape Spada was straightforward: 1 Italian light cruiser sunk, her sister ship damaged, the mission to threaten British convoys in the Aegean aborted entirely, and the 2 cruisers' planned deployment to the Dodecanese permanently cancelled. The strategic consequence was somewhat more nuanced. The Regia Marina retained a substantial surface fleet and would continue to contest the Mediterranean for the next 3 years. But the engagement had demonstrated, in terms the Italian command could not ignore, that British convoy routes in the eastern Mediterranean were not as exposed as they might have appeared, and that British destroyers operating as bait, whether by design or fortune, could bring heavier forces onto an overconfident pursuer. Naval historians Jack Green and Alessandro Massignani, in their analysis of the battle, argued that Casardi had been excessively cautious in the opening phase. By maintaining long range and declining to close aggressively on the destroyers, he had denied himself the opportunity to destroy them before Sydney arrived. Had he pressed in, the 4 destroyers would have been in serious difficulty. The range he maintained was also, paradoxically, a range at which his own gunnery was less effective, as the 500 shell total and single hit result demonstrated. Vincent O'Hara, writing separately, identified the decisive factor as the British volume of fire. Sydney alone fired around 1,300 shells and scored 5 hits. The Italians, with 2 ships and comparable armament, scored 1 hit between them. O'Hara attributed the British superiority directly to their higher rate of fire and the training and procedures that sustained it under action conditions. The Giussano-class design philosophy, maximum speed, maximum armament, minimum armor, had been validated as a concept for hunting French destroyers. Against a British light cruiser with comparable guns but superior gunnery routines, and against the unforeseen arrival of that cruiser from beyond the horizon, it offered no compensating advantage. The armor that Bartolomeo Colleoni did not carry was precisely the armor that might have bought her time when Sydney's 152mm rounds began to land. In the pre-dawn hours of the 19th of July, 1940, the 4 destroyers of the patrol, Hyperion, Ilex, Hero, and Hasty, were by any conventional reckoning the outgunned party in that stretch of water north of Crete. 2 cruisers, 16 heavy guns, a combined displacement of well over 10,000 tons between them, and an admiral who believed he was hunting an escort force with nothing behind it but unarmed merchant ships. The destroyers were smaller, lighter, less armed, and they knew it. They ran because running was the correct decision, and because running bought the seconds and miles that brought Sydney onto the scene. Nobody present at Cape Spada that morning would have called HMS Hyperion and her consorts the dominant force in the engagement. But when the torpedo struck amidships and Bartolomeo Colleoni went down, the question of which side was outgunned had received a rather definitive answer, and it was not the answer the Italian admiral had expected when he ordered the pursuit at 6:27. If you watched this account to its conclusion, the channel is grateful for your time. Should you wish to see more stories of the ships and actions that shaped the naval war, many of them, like this one, involving vessels that should not have won and did, subscribing and turning on notifications will ensure you see each new account as it arrives. A like on the video also helps the channel considerably. There are more overlooked ships where Hyperion came from, and their stories deserve to be told properly.